double click, and yes, I am recording because it says I can stop the screen recording. Alright. In a perfect world, we would edit this out, but this is not a perfect world. I have created for you another installment of the video series. This time, let me see if I can large screen this for you. This time, the contrast in form equaling the contrast in view or feelings towards theme. Basically, the concept is this. A lot of the time, you're going to find a poem, and there'll be a very, very easy contrast. Either it's going to be a crazy free verse poem with lines all over the place, with rhymes all over the place, with a meter you couldn't possibly distinguish. Blessing is like this, Poem at 39 is like this. I would say 2:30 often is like this, gets like this in some ways. Hide and seek. Just no perceptible rhyme or reason to the thing. On the other hand, you have poems with very closed verse, very clear meter and structure. The sonnets, the villanelle. Piano, I would say. The rhyme scheme there is the couplets in piano. The meter, the lines, you can see it, or photographer. You can sort of see a very, very clear structure. So, about, I would say, 65% of your poems are free verse, 35% are closed verse. As we go back in the centuries, that ratio reverses. But the point was, so you have this obvious contrast. So you can always make that contrast between whatever poem you deal with as an unseen poem and the 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 poems that you have that are of the opposite structure. So if it's a fixed verse poem, the 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 poems you have that have free verse. If it's a free verse poem, the opposite. But what do we do with this? And I just want to give you yet another writing template for how we take a contrast in form and we turn it into a contrast in meaning. We just basically say, why is there a contrast in formal devices? Because there's a contrast in attitude. It's a bit of a reverse engineering of poetry, where we say, listen, if a poetic device is used to express something, and that poetic device is not used, then probably they're trying to express something else. It's not a huge leap. It's more about giving you the language, giving you 4 examples to deal with this. Alright, so the general template is very, very easy. I imagine this, again, you have a body paragraph, you've kind of written your way, but as often is the case, you've forgotten about contrasts, now you're scrambling for contrasts, and you have a contrast, but how do you write about this contrast? How do you write about it? And here's the template. It's the simplest template. Contrast between the poem's use, so we've already written a few body paragraphs about these poems, so we don't even need to name them with this thesis statement. We just say the contrast between the poem's use of rhyming, structure, pronouns, repetition, imagery, formal device, reflects a contrast in their attitude or view of or feeling towards, and then I've given you a million different themes: war, death, identity, language, love, family, memory, etc. So, we show the contrast between free verse and closed verse, and the contrast in emotional attitude towards a theme. And the contrast between a certain representation, a certain meaning that they give to this theme. Alright, let's see how this works in practice, because all of these things really could use the examples. The contrast between the poem's use of structure reflects the contrast in their feelings towards death. And here, you do have to name the poem at some point. In Poem at 39, the freed verse reflects the emotional turmoil the speaker expresses towards her father's death. Her roaming memories of him and her affection mixed with guilt and regret at not having spent more time with him. I think this is generally good. I think I personally have this problem where when I talk about overall structure, I am not emotionally attached to quotes. I think when an exam board looks at this, they would say it's fine, but they would prefer it if, unlike me, you added half a phrase here and there about showing the affection, showing it mixed with guilt and regret. To me, this is close enough to just a paraphrase of the poem, and the point is general enough for me not to use evidence, but, you know, when you grow older, you ride a bicycle sometimes in a fairly unsafe way. That's not to suggest you should follow me to a T. So that would be my one revision suggestion from myself. By contrast, in Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night, the villanelle structure gives the feeling of a more resolved attitude towards death, as the cleanly repeated lines and highly structured closed verse form show unflinching anger towards death. There is much less room for emotional turmoil in a poem forced to repeat a refrain of rage by virtue of its structure. So, notice this little semicolon? That's because I felt like the point about cleanly repeated lines and highly structured closed verse showing unflinching anger was not 100% clear to the reader from what I was saying. Like, I was making a leap there that the reader may not have joined me in. For instance, the reader might say, how is a highly structured closed verse form showing unflinching anger? And part of that is the refrain has the word rage, and once it has the word rage and it's in a villanelle form, you're kind of stuck in this raged world. Outraged world. Alright. So here we go. Free verse, more space for emotional turmoil. Closed verse with rage in its refrains. Here too, I may have gotten a little lazy because I'm writing a bunch of these, and because the template is more important to me in some ways than the details. So you might add more specificity here with the cleanly repeated lines and highly structured closed verse form. I would talk about the multiple refrains, I would talk about the 6 tercets, 5 tercets in the quatrain, 5 tercets in the quatrain, da-da-dum. I would throw in some terminology there. But the bigger point for me was how the contrast in form maps onto, suggests a contrast in attitude. More emotional turmoil, less emotional turmoil. More emotional consistency. More consistent structure, less consistent structure. Pretty straightforward. I think this would still get full marks if I had a kind examiner. But some of them might say, more evidence, which just means they want a quote here with her affection mixed with guilt and regret, which I could have done. And they probably want a couple more details for what the villanelle structure is, which I also could have done. Anyway, but I also, one of the things is I'm trying to recreate an exam setting, so I kind of did this just looking at the poems, but not necessarily taking forever to do it, so that you have a closer approximation to an exam. Alright, the contrast between the poem's use of pronouns mirrors / reflects the contrast in their approach to childhood. So if you've been using reflects, and you don't want to seem so very formulaic, you switch to mirrors. Why not? Shows would work. Suggests would also work. A lot of the spice words would work. Okay. The contrast in their approach to childhood. Hide and Seek mostly treats its speaker as a you facing a they, showing the poem's view of childhood as an ongoing battle game between the child and those around him. Half Past Two, on the other hand, suggests childhood's battle with the environment is a losing one, by referring to the child as a he, never giving them the agency of a first or second person pronoun. Think that works. If you wanted to add another, that is, just as Scanlon, just as the poet's child can't become an I, in the poem, he can never overcome the social pressures of the poem. That's if you wanted. I have this flaw. I believe all writers have flaws. My flaw is I kind of assume the reader is with me sometimes as I make these logical leaps. But I also know that that's often not the case, so I'll like to add a sentence or two clarifying what I said. It's totally fine. If you add 3 or 4 sentences clarifying what you're saying, at that point you're losing focus, because you want to keep hitting that contrast. So you don't want to be writing about one poem for more than a few lines before moving to the contrast, because the thesis is about the contrast. Okay. Example 3 of 4. Contrast between the two poems' use of light imagery reflects the contrast in their view of love. Now, when I say use of light imagery, I count darkness as use of light imagery, but if you wanted to say use of light and dark imagery, or lighting imagery, to be yet more accurate, I'm always fine with that. Shakespeare's Sonnet 116 uses the imagery of the North Star to present love's consistency, which, like the light from a star, is never shaken by time and tempests. Remember, by contrast, has a much frailer view of love, one that uses darkness as a central image, and is very much concerned with the possibility of light fading. As the poem ends on a fraction of Shakespeare's light-consumed love, a mere vestige of memory. So, some good language there for sharp contrasts. You have light in one poem, darkness in another, light-filled view of love. Love is this ever-present light. Love is a vestige, fraction of a memory. Just a little bit, tiny bit of love remaining. Just try a tiny bit. Don't worry about it if you don't even have that tiny bit. It's okay. I think, again, the point being, you've hit the formal device, the kind of image they are using, light versus darkness, and you've hit the different views of love. Frail versus consistent, everlasting. Points, points, points. And I've even quoted from the poem in this case, because I'm talking about something more specific. Alright. Now, enjambment. You guys know how much I love enjambment. The contrast between the two poems' use of enjambment reflects in contrast in their attitude towards childhood. In Piano, childhood is a half-lost memory, and the enjambment takes us back down the vista of years, literally down the lines. Oh, no. Oh, no. Command Z. There we go. In a sense, predicting the drop in the speaker's mood as he travels back in time, or even time before it was typoed. It shows childhood as a lost and costly art, a thing that requires an emasculating, casting line break down of manhood, and ultimately leads to weeping. The breakdown in the lines reflecting the speaker's emotional breakdown as he approaches childhood. So, a little bit abstract from time to time, but it has this beautiful thing that I love about talking about enjambment, where the lines are doing what the feelings are doing. You break down, the lines go down. You rush forward, the lines rush forward. Enjambment can really reflect a lot of different things. It's a very versatile literal device. As are many of them, I suspect. And that's why the contrast between their use of enjambment reflects a contrast in their attitude. By contrast, blessing uses enjambment as a rushing forward towards the bursting pipes. You could have put bursting pipes in quotes. You could have. You could have. I'm gonna do it because somehow in the examiner's mind that's better. The lines flowing like the freed water. So you see, again, you want the lines to reflect the meaning of the poem. Like the freed water and gathering like the congregation of every man, woman, line break, child. Childhood here is not a thing of the past, nor is it an act of failed nostalgia. It is far more urgent, like its enjambment, battling for life itself, rather than regretting its memories. So instead of the enjambment kind of cutting down our manhood, which you could keep writing, instead of it cutting down, casting us downwards, we have an enjambment of the liquid light sun. We have an enjambment of rushing forward to get water. And childhood is this jubilant but terrifying battle for life, which is a very, very, very different view from a much more aged, failed effort at childhood. Childhood is this bad memory. Bad both when it's good and when it's bad. Bad in the sense that you can't quite capture it and you can't quite return to it, but it costs you your manhood anyway. Like, you don't get to be a child and you don't get to be a man. It's a very different effect childhood has than, again, this yearning, this battle that the enjambment creates in blessing. Alright, so 4 different devices. Is it 4? I believe so. Enjambment, imagery. What did we have here? Pronouns. Structure. Overall, free versus closed verse. And the same move. Shows us a difference in attitude. Then you hit how that device is showing that attitude here. Or the lack of the device. The imagery of light versus the imagery of darkness. The use of a rhyme scheme and a very structured villanelle form versus free verse. And you basically go from there. Alright, that was a good little video. Hopefully not too long. Thank you so much for listening, and let us hope that there will be more to come in the coming days before your test. And good luck if there isn't. Good luck if there isn't. I am sure you will do fairly well. Fairly well. You've worked so hard. Alright. This is my very, very elaborate way of saying I now have to figure out how to turn off video recording. Stop screen recording. Alright, have a good one.